one sentence that I try to describe Bridgewater by, and it's meaningful work and meaningful relationships. This is what I want. Meaningful work and meaningful relationships through radical truth and radical transparency. So meaningful work means like we're in a mission together, we're excited about what we do, we want to do it excellently, that's meaningful work. Meaningful relationships are these relationships in where there's, like the honesty helps you. You can argue things through, but you always know that there's honesty and that there's mutual caring for each other. Radical truth means that knowing what is true, to be able to deal with reality, whether you like the reality or not, but to know what reality is. Like, imagine if you had a disease, would you want to know that you had that disease, or would you not want to know? I'd want to know. And so to know, if you have a weakness, do you want to know you have the weakness, or do you not want to know? Radical truth and radical transparency means you get to see everything. That's very powerful. Failure is a part of the learning process, right? What's the risk of failure? What, you'll be embarrassed, or risk of failure? How do you distinguish failure from learning? In your whole life, failure implies that it stopped, that the game stops, right? If it's part of you're failing and then you learn, then that learning is part of the moving forward, right? So that is what the process is like. Fail, learn, move forward, and constantly do that because you're cutting edge. You're going where people haven't been before in inventiveness. What happens with meditation, as you know, is it's just a simple exercise that allows you first to clear your head and then brings an equanimity to everything. Everything, it eliminates the stress, it eliminates the emotion.
And you do it how often? You're a busy guy.
Yeah, I've been doing it for 44 years, but I do it, twice a day, probably a third of the time, once a day, probably a third of the time, and not at all.
For 20 minutes, twice a day.
Yeah.
So you spend 40 minutes a day as part of your...
Oh, it's such a great investment. I would say that more than any other factor having any effect on my success, it's been meditation. Because the equanimity and also the creativity, because it opens between literally the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, it opens the two sides of the brains and it allows a spontaneity, a creativity, an open-mindedness. And so it's good for not only the health, because you get stress is a terrible thing, but it also is very good in terms of the clarity and you don't get the emotional hijacking, and it's great for creativity. So it's helped me a lot. It's the biggest gift I can give anyone. I'm 64 years old.
Yeah.
I don't want to have fears of things of being open. Fears of, in other words, I'm not going to let a fear stand in the way of something that I believe is valuable. Sometimes the high points come from the low points. They're simultaneously, meaning I learn the most when I am making mistakes. And so I know, if I'm making money in the market, it might seem like a high point because you figure, okay, you're making money, but you don't test yourself as much. When you're making a low point and you're in misery, you're saying, how am I doing this wrong? And you're learning a lot, or at least I'm learning a lot. First of all, I have a terrible memory. I'm very unreliable. I'm incredibly forgetful. I need people around who will take care of a lot of things that for me. In other words, I need handlers. And people who are meticulous and organized. And those are those would be the major. I miss, by the way, at any time, I believe that I'm missing a lot. I look at, there's so many things that I'm not seeing. The one thing that's good about that is that I know that I'm not seeing them. And so that's why I keep going to other people who I find see differently. And that's my biggest advantage. My biggest advantage is not what I know. What I know is a small percentage of what I need to know. My biggest advantage is that I know that I don't know a lot, and I'm worried about not knowing, and that I know how to speak to people who might know a lot, and then have that process, and then through that I learn a lot and I minimize my chances of harming myself because I don't know.